Welcome, everyone. This is the Nonprofit Startup 2.0. For any of you that may have attended our startup workshop, we're going to delve a little deeper into board development, strategic planning, storytelling, and record keeping. So go ahead, Melinda, the next one. The Small Business Development Center at UNF covers 18 counties in Northeast Florida. And oops, where did my photo go?
I don't know. So sorry.
Well, that's okay. It's the weather. We're blaming the weather today.
Yeah.
But just to give you a little bit of a commercial for the Small Business Development Center, we cover 18 counties in Northeast Florida, have satellite offices in Jacksonville, Nassau County, Clay County, St. Johns County, Putnam County, Marion County, Alachua County, and various other part-time offices. The SBDC provides no-cost consulting for businesses, for startup businesses, as well as existing businesses, as well as nonprofit organizations. I'm Nancy Boyle, and I am the director of the Small Business Resource Network program, as well as a consultant with the Small Business Development Center. My colleague is Melinda Powers. Melinda is a consultant with the Small Business Development Center. She is a recovering attorney. She has a past background as an attorney, and she also works with a number of local nonprofit organizations. Okay, Melinda, I'm going to turn it over to you.
All right. So today we're going to be talking with you about, you're going to fall into two different camps. You're going to be what we call a newly minted nonprofit, which means you filed your paperwork. That means you've done the work with SunBiz. You've gotten your 501c3 designation approved by the IRS. You have about 5 to 7 board members in place. Your bylaws have been approved by your board. You're taking donations or able to take donations, and you're planning events and programs. So we're either speaking about your situation, or you're an existing nonprofit that has been in operation for 3+ years. You have received grant funding at some point or are currently receiving grant funding. Your programs are set and routine. Your board meets consistently, and you're finding the need to rebrand or pivot the organization for various reasons. So our deliverables to you today will be Nancy, in her part of the presentation, will be discussing strategic planning and how your board and organization can benefit from that. And also board duties, specifically, what does the board do? What is the board responsible for? Because not everyone knows, and it's really important for board members to be educated. And then I will be discussing the art of storytelling, because that's a really pivotal part of how you get your message out to get interest from donors, from partners, from volunteers, from staff, and from board members, and also your record keeping, which sometimes can be lacking, but we want to help you build up your organization and give you some tips on how you can do that a little bit better. All right, Nancy.
All right, strategic planning, what is it? How is it different from a business plan, and how will it help your organization? So we're going to look at both of these elements. So a strategic plan, that's how you communicate your mission, your vision, your goals and objectives. It's your strategy for moving forward. You know, if you're going to solicit funds from other organizations or government entities, they want to know, what is it that you're going to do? How are you going to do it? What effect is it going to have on the community? And if you don't have a strategic plan, a well thought out strategic plan, then it's going to be really hard for those funding sources to take you seriously. So I do like this quote. Simply put, strategic planning determines where an organization is going over the next year or more, and how it's going to get there. Typically, the process is organization-wide or focused on a major function, such as a division, department, or other major functions. Now, that sounds pretty comprehensive, and for those of you that are in existing, you may have different programs, you may have different departments. Frequently, what we're talking to are the startup nonprofits, the folks who are in the early stages, and they don't have the luxury or the people or the funding to have major functions, divisions, departments. And so it falls into the organization as an organization-wide strategic plan. Okay. So what's involved in a strategic plan? A description of the organization. Who are you and what are you all about? What's your story? How did this come about? And Melinda's going to go into more depth on the storytelling aspect, because your story is what's going to get you the funding. What's your purpose? Why do you exist? What's your mission? What specifically are you going to do to better the community? What's your business model? How are you going to accomplish what you're trying to accomplish? How are you going to, who are your customers? Who are your clients? How are you going to help them? You know, what are your strengths? When we say object of desire, really, what's the ultimate goal that you're trying to achieve? If your organization has been set up with the purpose of educating young children or providing services to a disabled population, or whatever it is that your organization is trying to do, what is it that you really want to accomplish? What is your vision? What is it going to look like when you get there? And what are the objectives that you're going to establish in order to get there? All right. You need a generic strategy, an overall strategy for the organization. If you have multiple programs, you're going to need a strategy for each one of those programs. Who's your customer? You know, we look at this, and I think one of the myths out there is that a nonprofit organization is different from a for-profit organization. It's not. The only difference is, you know, you're tax exempt and how you report your revenues coming in. You don't have distributions to owners because nobody owns a nonprofit organization. You have a governing board, you have a board of directors who is responsible for making it work, but it's community based. It's how you better serve the community. So who is your customer? Who's your competitor? Are there other organizations out there that are doing what you're doing? And then if that's the case, if they're doing it well, why are you doing what you're doing? So you need to really be clear about who's your customer, how you select those customers. If you have identified that you're going to establish this nonprofit organization to provide, let's say you're going to provide financial training to middle school and high school students, so that they really understand what the world is like beyond their school. And you've identified that your customer group, or the people that you're going to serve, you're going to provide this education to, are kids 10 through 18. Okay, well, are they your customer? I mean, can that 10-year-old kid decide whether or not they're going to participate in your program? So, you know, you may want to look beyond. This is the community that we want to serve. This is the problem. They don't understand finances. So we want to educate them so that they're better equipped to exist in the real world. But who's the customer? The customer's their parents. Their parents are going to make the decision on whether or not that child is going to participate in the program. What opportunities are out there? You know, typically a nonprofit organization is started because someone has had a very tragic or traumatic experience and they want to do something so that other people don't have to have that experience. Or there's a need in the community that nobody is filling and they feel like they can fill it. So part of your strategic plan is, what is the problem that you're trying to solve? You know, how are you going to, Melinda uses the P word, and, you know, we're all tired of the P word, the pivot word. But if you're an existing organization, and we've all gone through almost 2 years now of COVID, are the things that you're doing still effective? Are you still being efficient? Or do you need to kind of scrap some of the things that you've done before and create new things? So what are the opportunities out there? How are you going to solve whatever those problems are, or take advantage of what those opportunities are? And then what's going to stop you? What happens if you go in this direction and it doesn't work? Or you run up against roadblocks and you have to figure out ways to get around those roadblocks. So you have to take a really good look inside the organization. So what are those internal forces that come into play? Is it human resources? Do we have the right people? Do we have the right mindset? Is everybody on board and in alignment with what our mission is? What, as an organization, do we need to think about? Do we need to change the structure of our organization? Is it effective the way it is? Or do we need to look at modifying it? What's going on in the world around us? You know, we've all been thrown into chaos, like I said, for the last almost 2 years. So what's going on in the world around us that's going to impact what we do? So it's almost as if you're doing a SWOT analysis: strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. So what are those elements outside, not only outside the organization, but inside the organization, that may or may not either create a problem or offer an opportunity? Next one. Okay. How will you overcome the obstacles and win? Who's your competition? What are they doing? Are they doing effectively? Is there an area that maybe they're not doing effectively? Maybe they're doing similar things. If we go back to the example of financial education for students 10 through 18, are there other organizations that are doing that kind of training? If you're just getting started and you have a passion for something and you feel like you want to set up a nonprofit organization to achieve this particular purpose, you know, who else is doing that? And instead of you starting your own organization, is there a way that you can partner with an established organization? You know, they already have their paperwork, they've done their applications or their articles of incorporation to the state of Florida. They've received their tax exempt status back from the IRS. They're all set up. They've got a network, they're marketing. If you're starting, excuse me, if you're starting from scratch, you've got a long road to hoe, as they say. You know, is it helpful to look at that organization, hey, and approach them and say, hey, I see you guys are doing this and you're doing it really well, but there's an area over here that I think maybe you could do better, and I'm willing to do that, and I'll provide the funding if we can partner up. So a competitive, understanding who your competition is, what they do, what your unique position is, which is the same as with a for-profit, is very important. You need to include that in your strategic plan. It shows funding sources that you've given this a lot of thought, and that you know what you're up against, and you know exactly how you're going to handle it and how you're going to move forward. What kind of impact are you going to have? Many moons ago, when I first got started with the Small Business Development Center, and we were doing our grant proposals to the city, it was enough to tell them you were going to do this, that, and the other thing. Today, funding sources want to know, what are the results? If somebody enters your program, and maybe it's a 6-week financial training program, and when they enter it, they don't know anything about a checkbook, and at the end, what's the result? Do they understand how to keep a checkbook? Do they understand expenses? Do they understand the need to create revenue in a legal and appropriate way? What are the results? What are the objectives that you're trying to achieve? And then what are the results? Did you achieve it? Were the folks who entered your program better off at the end of the program? And then you need to talk finances. Obviously, funding sources want to know, how much money do you need? What do you need it for? How are you going to use it? How are you going to leverage the money I give you with other funds coming in? No funding source is going to want to be a sole source funder for any organization. They want to see that other people are interested in funding this organization and making it work. Okay. All right, let's move on to the board. Your board is a key role. They have a key role here in making sure that the organization stays on mission, and that they're spending the money appropriately, and that the organization is contributing to the community. Is your board organized? Is it properly organized? Frequently, when we're talking to startups, startup nonprofit organizations, and we explain to them, look, you know, before you can file your articles of incorporation, you need to have a minimum of 3 board members besides yourself. And what happens is they go to their family and they go to their friends. Well, if they have a big family and there's 4 all from the same family, well, that looks like to the IRS that it's a family foundation. It doesn't look like it's a nonprofit organization. So you want to make
one other thing, Nancy, I'm sorry.
no, go right ahead.
People do include themselves in that 3. That happens a lot of the time. That's what I see a lot. And I understand you need the minimum to qualify for the application, but it's probably not the best approach, but it happens a lot.
Yeah. Yeah, it just doesn't look, the optics are not good if everybody has the same last name.
Right.
So is it properly organized? You know, and it's great that you have this passion, that you want to do this, and you have people who are willing to support you. But when the rubber meets the road, are they going to get out and fundraise for you? Are they going to volunteer their time? Are they going to be an advocate? Have you organized this board in an effective manner? Do they understand the legal obligations? You know, a board member being on a nonprofit board is a volunteer position. Board members are not paid. You know, and I think that's another fallacy out there. Oh, I can be on a board and I'm going to make money doing this. No, you're not. And in fact, you have a fiduciary responsibility to this organization to make sure the organization is spending the money properly. That if they approach a government agency or foundation, they say, give us so much dollars for this particular program, that those dollars are spent on that program. So it's very important that board members understand what their roles and responsibilities are, that everybody's really clear on what the mission of the organization is, and that they're willing to support the organization not only as an individual, but they're able to work together collectively on behalf of the organization to promote it. Okay. Next, Melinda. Okay. Kinds of nonprofit boards. Okay, we start out as an organizing board. I mean, if you think about it, this group of people is coming together with this common purpose. Well, now we got to figure out how we're going to set this up properly. We've got to come together and develop bylaws. We've got to come up with policies and procedures. We have to apply to the state of Florida for our incorporation status. We have to apply to the IRS for our tax exempt status. We have to apply to the Department of Agriculture Consumer Affairs Board for solicitation permit. You have to get a business license. You know, so there's a lot of organizing that takes place as a new nonprofit is getting started. And once a lot of these things are put into place and the board has done their strategic planning, they have goals and objectives that they're trying to work towards, then the board sort of morphs into being more of a governing board, more of a board that makes sure that everything is very transparent, that we're following all the rules and regulations, that we're doing things properly. And then, of course, fundraising, which happens throughout this process. While you're organizing, you're fundraising and you're governing. While you're governing, you're organizing and you're fundraising. So when we say there's 3 kinds of boards, it's what's the major emphasis for a particular point in time. And once you achieve one thing, then you can expand and focus more of those hours and that attention on some of these other areas. But a board is constantly fundraising, whether it's just talking to people and looking for donations, whether it's writing grants, whether it's looking for sponsorships, whatever it is, board members need to understand that part of their role as a board member is to fundraise for the organization. We call it nonprofit organizations, but if you don't have more money coming in at the end of the day than went out, then you're not going to last. Okay. All right. So here's a simple organizational chart for a nonprofit organization. Obviously, at the head is the board of directors. It is up to the board to set policy, to set strategy, to set the overall emphasis of the organization. The board hires the executive director. The board I use the word monitors. I don't mean micromanage. What I mean is set policy and guide and direct. But it's the executive director that handles the day-to-day operations of the organization. They hire the staff, they manage the staff, they direct the staff. There may be an advisory board. And when you're out there looking for good board members, you may find people have an interest in what you're doing. They want to support what you do, but they can't commit to being on a board of directors. But maybe because of what it is they do, maybe they're a professional, they're an accountant, an attorney, marketing person, whatever it is, they may be willing to act as advisors to the organization. And so the executive director has to manage the advisory board as well. Staff typically manages volunteers. So next.
Sorry, had to look up the slide.
All right. So let's talk about these 10 board responsibility. Number one, it's the board's responsibility to determine what the organization's mission and purpose is. It's up to the board to do the strategic planning, to establish the goals, the objectives, to really identify who are those primary constituents that we're going to serve. It's the board that selects the executive director that is going to make sure that that person who's handling the day-to-day operation of the organization is qualified and that they're on the right track, that they're fulfilling what the overall purpose and mission of the organization is. The board also provides the proper financial oversight. Now, remember, this is, as a nonprofit organization, everything is transparent. So the board is developing the budget. They're making sure that financial controls are in place so that, the financial aspect of the organization is running smoothly. And it's up to the board to make sure that there are enough resources for the organization to fulfill its responsibilities. They also have to ensure that the legal and ethical integrity is there and that everyone is accountable. It's up to the board. If somebody in that organization winds up embezzling, it's the board that's going to feel those ramifications. So, and there is insurance out there that you can buy, board errors and omissions insurance for board members. So I encourage every one of you, if you are currently an established organization, that you do have that insurance. So, ultimately everything falls on the board. So the board needs to be really aware of what their responsibilities are. So you can go to the next one, Melinda. The board is responsible for planning for the organization, and board members need to participate. They don't need to be token names on letterhead, which unfortunately some people do. You want board members that are doers. They need to actively participate, not only in the planning, but in the implementation. Maybe not down to the day-to-day operations of a particular program, but it's up to the board to oversee everything. They're responsible to recruit and train new board members and to assess how the board is performing. I think we've all been out there in the business world and you work with people and some people do not operate up to, I'm trying to be delicate about this, 100% of what they're supposed to do. It's up to the board that if somebody is not living up to what's expected, and we all have issues that come up. I mean, sometimes life happens, but it's up to the board to make sure that all the board members are participating to the best of their ability and that everybody's on the same page. It's the board that's out there in the world. They're the face. The executive director is to a great degree as well, but it's the board and the executive director that are the face of the organization in the community, and they have to act accordingly, and they're advocates. You know, anytime you're out there and you're representing an organization, you want to do it in a very professional manner. Okay, the board determines, monitors, and strengthens the organization's programs and services. So again, it's reassessing things on an annual basis. There's a thing called mission creep, and it happens a lot to organizations, especially in the early stages. You know, you've got this plan, you've got this program, you're seeking funding, and you're going to focus in on kids aged 10 through 18, and then you get an organization that says, well, could you do this for young, from folks that are in their 20s, or can you do this to help seniors? Well, that's mission creep. And is it in line with your mission? If it is, great. If it's not, you have to say, maybe not now. And it also could happen that the board agrees that maybe the mission of their organization can expand. So, but if you don't monitor those programs and services, at least on an annual basis, when you're doing your strategic planning, then it's easy to sort of fall into these traps. Okay, and finally, it's the board's responsibility to support the chief executive and to assess their performance. If the executive director is falling down on the job, then it's time to be replaced. So it's up to the board to make sure that the organization is running effectively, that the executive director is doing his or her job in managing the organization on a day-to-day basis. So there's a lot there that the board is responsible for. Go to the next one. Okay, so there's three duties, shall we say, of all board members. A duty of care is really about the level of competence that is expected of board members. You know, it's up to the board members to care for the organization, to do what's right for the organization. You know, the board is legally responsible for the organization, and in some cases they could be financially liable if it's viewed that they are behaving in a way that's contrary to the highest and best for that organization. The duty of loyalty. Now, this is a big one. It's really important that all board members are free of any conflict of interest. As part of the legal papers that you're going to put together when it's bylaws and policy time, you need to have a conflict of interest statement in there, and all board members need to sign it. If you are ever audited by the IRS and you do not have a conflict of interest statement, it's a $10,000 fine. So, you know, all board members must be free of any kind of, even the appearance of allegiance to something else when they're making decisions. You know, maybe you have a printer that's on your board and the board is deciding on a printing project. That board member needs to recuse themselves. They need to not be in that position to appear to have a conflict of interest. And the final one is duty of obedience. Board members are expected, well, everybody within the organization, but board members especially, are expected to behave in a way that is consistent with the mission of the organization. Okay, you want to go on to the next one?
Mm-hmm.
So what are some of the committees that typically are that boards need to function? And again, you know, if you're a small organization and it's you and 3 board members while you're getting started, you know, everybody's kind of on all these committees. But as the nonprofit organization grows and expands, and you have more funding and you have more resources, you have more people, then these are the areas that are important for the successful organization, successful success of the organization. So the executive committee, and that could mean, you know, maybe you have a board that's 15 people. Maybe your executive committee is 4 or 5 people, you know, the president, the secretary, the treasurer, the fundraising chair, or committee chairs. But the executive committee is responsible for the full board. Okay, your nominating committee. That committee is going to look for good board members. They're going to screen them. They're going to recommend them to the full board. You know, and you always want good Not that people are bad, but you want people that are going to work on behalf of the organization and not, like I said before, be a name on somebody's letterhead. You need a fundraising committee. It's up to this committee to develop and implement a plan, okay, that involves everybody. Finance committee is going to be the committee that watches the money. They're going to set the budget and they're going to watch how the money is spent. Marketing, PR, government relations, all of the marketing that goes to the outside falls under the marketing, PR, government relations committee. And their purpose is visibility in the community, to make sure that the community is aware of what the organization does, try to garner as much support for the organization, whether it's emotional support, whether it's in-kind support, whether it's financial support. But that's the face of the organization. That committee is responsible for, like I said, the face of the organization to the community. The bylaws committee. The bylaws are your governing entity. Melinda will probably talk a little bit more about bylaws, but your bylaws are really the guiding document. You want to make sure that you're adhering to the bylaws. You don't want them so specific that you have in there, the board's going to meet on the second Tuesday of every month, except in December on odd number years. I mean, you need some flexibility, but it is the guidelines that the organization goes by. And then strategic planning. It's up to the strategic planning committee really to get started, maybe to facilitate, but the whole board needs to be involved in implementing the strategic plan, in creating and implementing the strategic plan. So those are just some of the committees. And like I said, if you're early stage in your nonprofit, it may be that you have all 4 people in charge of all of these committees, but you're doing some element of this to be effective. So now I'm going to segue it over to my colleague Melinda to talk about storytelling.
Thank you, Nancy. Thank you for all that great information. So I'm going to transition a little bit into more of the kind of abstract parts of this. So storytelling. You have to know who your audience is. Like Nancy alluded to, you have to know who your customer is. And that's going to also determine part of your audience. Your audience is not just the people you serve, but it's your partners, other stakeholders, volunteers, staff. And you have to make sure your message is understood by whoever it is you're talking to in a moment. When you're trying to get donations and gather new donors, that's going to be a different message than someone that you're trying to serve as a quote customer. So you have to be very clear on who you're talking to in a moment and what they want to hear and what they want to know. Everyone is seeking different information. Someone who wants to take advantage of your program wants to know, how is it helpful? What's involved? What do they have to do? A donor is going to want to know, how are you spending the money? What do your finances look like? How can I help? What do you need? Volunteers, how much time do you need from me? This is how much time I'm willing to give, and they want to make sure that that fits with what they have to offer. So everyone wants to know different information, and it's very important that you understand your audience enough to be able to answer these questions for each segment of your audience. How do you prove your claims? That can be proven through survey information. Obviously, you want to track data, especially if you're seeking grants. You're going to have to track your data, but you can do that in a way that helps you tell your story. So if you are serving children, you're helping them with after school tutoring or something of that nature. I'll give an example, maybe for like the state test that they have to take. If you can keep track of how many children are in the program and how their scores improve from year to year as they are participants in the program, then you can show, X amount of % of kids scored higher after getting tutoring from our program. And that can help be persuasive in letting people know that if we can do this with what we had, prior in funding, we could do more if we had more funding. It's a persuasive argument you're trying to make. It's not just, please give us money, we need it. That's not super persuasive. Everybody can make that claim. I can make that claim. So you have to be able to prove what it is you claim your program is doing. What will get their attention? Again, you have to know what it is they want to hear, what they're looking for, what they're interested in. Some donors are interested in serving particular causes. If you want to be a little more strategic in your search for donors and say these might be corporate donors, you can, scour their websites or their annual reports and see what kind of causes they normally give to. What are the things that they are interested in supporting? When you know that going in, it's a lot easier to be able to make a pitch for why they should support your program if you fall into those parameters or you're kind of adjacent or aligned with those same causes. It's not simply a random ask. It shouldn't be a random ask at all. Once you're more established, especially because you know the landscape, you know the competitors, you know the major players and the major donors in your area. So it should not be such a wild guess. Be compelling. So I always use the example of, if anybody remembers the ASPCA commercial with the dogs in the kennels and the sad song, that's super compelling. It's very easy to say, adopt homeless pets. I mean, pets are vulnerable. They need people to survive. And that's good and everything, but there's so much more you can add to that message to make it more compelling, like that commercial. And I know the commercial I'm talking about. I wish I could play it right now, but it's, the music is emotional. You see the pictures of the wounded animals, and it's just like, oh my God, you want to help all the puppies and kitties. There's a reason for that. And you should be able to do that through your messaging for your organization as well. Some people feel like that's, being, I don't know, for lack of a better word, manipulative, but it's not. It's really appealing to the emotional side of people, because that's why people spend money. When we're talking for profit, people buy off of emotion most of the time. It's not always logical. And you have to understand that about your audience, and you have to understand what their motivations are. And let's just be honest, when your emotions are involved and it's something you're really passionate about, you feel more compelled to support. And you should definitely leverage that if you're able to do so. Going back to surveys and stats and data and facts, those are all very important. You can do research on that and find existing data to support what you're doing, but you can also create your own, like I said, through surveys and things of that nature, so that you're establishing kind of a baseline of what you're doing and how it's working. Describing the results and outcomes that are demonstrated. Again, to that same point about surveys and your data, if you're not able to prove that you've demonstrated certain outcomes, it's going to be really hard to make a pitch for donations and for support, especially with grant writing. And I know grants is the hot topic. Everyone gets into nonprofit and they want grants right away. That's not necessarily how it works. But when you get to that point, when you're maybe 2 or 3 years established and you have to be able to prove those outcomes. That's part of the grant application. They're going to ask, what have you done? What are the outcomes? How is your program working? And that's your responsibility to be able to demonstrate. That's part of why they're going to give you the funds they're going to give you, but then they're also going to expect more outcomes, and you have to report those just the same. It's not just a one-way exchange. Be visual. Again, that commercial, I will never forget that commercial as long as I live. It was a very visual demonstration of what the ASPCA does to help animals. Use video and pictures and testimonials, and visible changes. What I mean in that is, like going back to the example for tutoring kids, when kids learn and they feel more confident, they feel empowered, they carry themselves differently. And you may even be able to show that visually and not just in the data. Or if you're helping people get out of, impoverished situations, they would look very different coming out of that than they would going in. And you have to be a little more savvy about learning how to show that visually. But testimonials are very persuasive as well. I like video testimonials more than I do written or just a photo and a quote. Video, you can get someone's inflection of their voice, the emotion behind what they're saying. And again, it's the emotion that's really going to be that it factor that can really be more persuasive for you. And like I said, more money can make more change. So if you were able to do this with $1, imagine what we could do with $1,000. That is always the appeal you're trying to make when you're asking for more funding. And that should logically be the case, that you've accomplished something with a little, but you could accomplish more with more. It should not be that you get more funding and you're not helping more and you're not making more of an impact. That's not a good example of impact. So being able to make that claim is nice, but being able to prove that you've done that in the past is even more persuasive. Oh, sorry about that. I'm going the wrong way. All right, storytelling techniques. So there's a common thread in all stories, and it's your job to set the stage and to paint that picture for your audience. And just understanding how stories are told helps, because we're used to it. We've been told stories since we were little. You know, we got read bedtime stories as kids, and we enjoy movies and series that we watch on Netflix or television because they're stories. We are driven by stories as people. So understanding the parts of a story helps. So with that, I have highlighted the exposition, the events, the resolution, and the outcome. And it's the same with your organization. You set the stage, you introduce the characters and the conflict or the problem. You show the series of events that lead to the resolution and the outcome. And your program is that solution. It should be, at least. So think of it in those terms, how your program can change the outcomes of people's lives in a positive way, and use that in your storytelling. Don't be afraid to talk about that, and don't be afraid to really lay it out. And I think less is more, you know, simple is good. You don't have to be too complicated when it comes to this. Just make it very clear that your program is the change agent in the story. And I think that can be super persuasive for donors, volunteer staff, and the people who actually take part in your program. So some of the techniques you can use is, you know, make it count. Make sure your story is relevant to your audience. You don't want to be telling a story that's relevant to your consumer. You don't want to tell that to the donor. You want to make sure you're keeping it aligned with what they expect to hear, what they want to know, and providing them with the information they need to make the decision to support. And that's going to be different for all the audiences, like I said. That's kind of marketing 101. You have to know who you're talking to. And when you're talking to everybody with the same message, you're not really talking to anyone, because they all have different motivations and they all have different things that they are desiring to achieve by potentially connecting with your organization. Don't make them wait. Sometimes I think we like to delay the resolution to the end, and it needs to be brought in as early as possible in the storytelling. You don't want to keep them guessing. So what worked? What helped? You want to make it very clear that your program is the key that opens the lock. And that's what's needed to solve the problem. You lay that problem out. You don't want to get too caught up in telling the background for too long, because it's hard to know where that's going. And you want to make sure your audience is following you and they're right on track with you as you're telling your story. And use detailed imagery, please, by all means. Like I said, going back to the commercial with the ASPCA, the imagery of those animals, they were in a really bad way, and it's to highlight that they need help. They need to be cared for, and no one's caring for them. So imagery is important. I mean, obviously you don't want to be too morbid and too gruesome with it, but sometimes it may require that, depending on what it is your program is involved with. Sometimes things aren't very pretty, but the outcomes can be very lovely, and it's nice to have contrast, but you have to just be discerning about that and not push it too far to where it may turn people off. But you want to be able to make that contrast between, so this is how it started and this is what we were able to do to help. And a stark contrast could be helpful depending on the situation. All right. So now we're switching gears to record keeping. So what should we be keeping track of exactly? And the answer is quite a few things, because your nonprofit is a business and it should be treated as such. And just like in a for-profit business, a lot of things need to be tracked to be effective. Not everyone is keeping track of those things, but that's okay. You can always start to pick up where you're missing some things. One though that I think is the most important is the finances. That should definitely be tracked very closely. As Nancy said, you're going to have committees eventually that will be doing that on a regular basis. But until you have separate people dedicated to that, and that's all they're really looking at, everyone should be aware of what's going on with the money. It shouldn't be a mystery where the money's being spent, how it's being spent, what's coming in, what's going out, what you guys want to bring in with your campaigns for fundraising. So all of those things should be tracked. Also, whatever your processes and procedures are for your program definitely should be recorded, put in writing, maybe even memorialized by video, because when you bring in staff and volunteers and even new board members, it's nice to be able to train them. And it's great when you have materials to do that with. So I would highly recommend that if that's not something you're currently doing. Keeping track of your volunteers. You want to know who's showing up. Who are you really getting a lot of hours from? Who's really interested in serving? Staff, obviously, that would be more kind of HR oriented, but that still needs to be tracked too. And then donors, you definitely should be keeping track of who's donating, how often, how much, and why. If you're able to even sit down and talk with the donors, which is recommended, especially if they're larger donors. What are their motivations behind why they're giving to your organization? What is it that they want to achieve? What goals do they have for the future? And it can also be a conversation where you talk about them maybe leaving assets to your organization when they pass away. Like, those are conversations that happen often with nonprofits. But if you're not taking advantage of them, you could lose the opportunity for funding in the future. All right, so this is an example. This is a kind of an exhaustive list of documents that you should be keeping regular track of, typically in a binder of some sort. If you're using online resources, that's fine too. Maybe you have documents in Google Docs or the clouds in some kind of cloud oriented platform, that's fine too, so that all of your board members can access it and staff and volunteers that need to access certain documents can. You also want to make sure some of these items are also available on your website for transparency purposes. I didn't mention it here, but being on GuideStar, which I heard just changed its name recently. Nancy, do you know about that?
I think right now they're still GuideStar.
Yeah, but I think there's some kind of talk about them changing their name. But anyway, GuideStar is a trusted source for transparency for boards, and you can post your 501c3 information there, your annual reports. You can make all those things, your 990s. You can make that stuff available so that people, really savvy donors, use GuideStar as a resource to decide where they're going to donate. Really savvy volunteers and maybe even people looking for jobs might check GuideStar as well. So it's a good place to be. You have to set up an account. There are paid and unpaid options. I'm certain there's the unpaid option, but there are also paid options as well. But anyways, so in this binder, you would want to have your mission statement. I actually recommend that everyone memorizes it, especially your board. They know what the mission statement is, so that when they're having conversations in the community about the organization, that it's very apparent that they know what the mission is, and they're not doing anything to, like Nancy's point about mission creep or mission drift, as it's called sometimes, like, being outside of the purview of what the mission of the organization is. So when you're talking to maybe even recruiting board members, if they're clear about what the organization does, there won't be any questions if they get on board, and they won't be confused. So anyway, the mission statement being a part of the binder is very important and something that everyone should be aware of. Your application for tax exempt ID number, your articles of incorporation with the state, your bylaws, definitely the bylaws. Everyone should know what's in there. You should be able to refer to them in a meeting if you have a question about maybe voting, or maybe someone wants to resign, or maybe if someone needs to be removed, what's the process for that? All of that should be found in the bylaws. vote. Yeah, like I said, voting already, but there should be explicit directions on all of those kinds of things in the bylaws, and you should be referring to those often when you have questions. The W-9, I'm not going to read the whole list, but you get the point. If you can get a screenshot of this, that's probably helpful too, but you'll get the recording later as well. But you want to make sure you're keeping track of all of the important documentation that the organization has, and it should all be found somewhere and be easily accessed by especially the board members, and even if someone requests them, like a volunteer or a staff member. The 990 form. So that is like the nonprofit tax return you are supposed to do every year. Some organizations do them in-house. Some organizations leave that to their accountant. It just depends on how you're set up. Make sure that regardless that it's being done properly and it is being done timely. It is your responsibility, the board's responsibility specifically, that that is filed on time every year. And if for any reason it's not, that falls on the board. I know there are penalties involved when that's not done, so you don't want to fall into that trap. So just make sure that that is on the calendar. Everyone's aware of the date that it's due, and that you can double check if you have a third party completing that for you, make sure it's done on time. This should be made available to the public. Like I said, potential donors, they would be checking for that because they want to see how your program allocates funds and how your program spends money. It's sometimes easy to tell from the budget and how the funds are spent, kind of what issues the program or the organization might be having internally. Very savvy people that are familiar with the nonprofit space can have that ability just from looking at paperwork. And so you want to make sure you're keeping everything documented, but then that is being scrutinized as well. So make sure you're having conversations. If you have an accountant, you know, what can we be doing differently? Are we doing this the best way? How can we make this better? It should always be that you're seeking to make improvements as you're going along. And here's GuideStar here. I mentioned it a little too early. I stole my own thunder. But GuideStar.org, definitely look into getting an account there for your organization so that you're represented on that site, because it is a very well-known resource.
And that's still an active link. They are changing the name to Candid, but you can still get it at GuideStar.org.
Thank you, Nancy. Yeah, I couldn't remember the name, but that's Candid.
Yeah, I know. I couldn't either.
So please take note of that. Financial management, one of the often overlooked pieces and probably one of the most important pieces. You just want to make sure that the money is being managed properly and that everyone is aware. In your meeting, your board meetings, the finances should be shared. You know, where you are in a snapshot in time and what's happening at that moment as far as what's going out, what's coming in, where money is going, where there might be some deficits. That does happen. But what's the plan to, you know, remedy that deficit? If you have any questions, you should be able to ask an accountant. Hopefully you're working with somebody that is well-versed. Maybe you have your treasurers and a CPA or an accountant. I would recommend having someone with a financial background of that nature as a board member if you can. Or maybe someone who has access to people like that, whether they're in banking or some kind of connection to the financial industry. I think that's a really helpful thing to have, because then sometimes they can spot issues early. They kind of have an idea of how to address issues when they do come up, and you're not blindsided or taken by surprise when something happens, and they can help you come up with a solution. You can also have people like that on your advisory board. I know Nancy mentioned advisory boards that can help steer you when you have issues. They don't need to necessarily be a full-time board member, but it's nice to be able to have access to people who have that kind of information and those resources when you need them. So it's really up to the executive director about those, you know, how those relationships are maintained, but it's really good to have, you know, those kind of people, you know, at the ready, waiting in the wings to help when you need the help. So Your financial management policies, they should center on the 5 areas of governance and accountability, investments, fundraising, risk management, and human resources. And all of these aspects are very important. Just like you do in your personal finances, like you might have a 401k or an IRA, your nonprofit can have investment accounts, and it should. You might get to the point where you want to do some kind of endowment of some sort. When those kind of things come up, it's very wise to speak to professionals, like I said, who are in that world that can help steer you in the right direction. But also, I would also say the CPA that's well versed in nonprofit is helpful too. And specifically asking for that is important because not all accountants deal in nonprofit work on a regular basis. And it's really nice when you encounter an accountant that does. If you're a client of ours, we have access to a directory with CPAs like that, if that's something you're looking for. So, keep note of that and make sure you contact us so that we can connect you, because it's a really great thing to have for your organization. All right, so nonprofit ratios. Not to get too much into the math, but just like a for-profit business can make determinations about the finances off of some numbers, so can nonprofits. They're businesses too. And there are ratios that you can work through, which are basically just simple formulas, simple mathematic formulas that can tell you information about your organization. So we have 2 here. The revenue ratio, I know it's at the bottom. I'm going to talk about it first though, but this talks about what portion of your revenues does each revenue stream represent. And you would just have, like, say you have donations and you have grants. If you want to know what percentage of your revenue comes from grants, you would just take the amount of grants divided by your total revenue, which is everything. And that will tell you. The reason why that's important is because you want to have diversified income, just like you would personally. You wouldn't, or if you're an investor, you don't want to just have all of your money in one stock or just have one kind of investment vehicle, like just stocks. They always say diversify your portfolio. It's the same for your organization, because what happens is when you rely too heavily on one source or 1 or 2 sources, if anything happens to those sources, which could be totally out of your control, it will definitely put your organization in a very undesirable situation. For instance, when we had the Great Recession back in 2008, I was actually studying shortly after that for a nonprofit management certificate. And one of the examples is we looked at 990s from heavily government funded nonprofits, because once that downturn happened in the economy, a lot of organizations lost federal funding because there was no money for that. It got allocated to other places to help stimulate the economy. And one of the hardest hit that we looked at was PBS, public broadcasting. It was ridiculous how much of their funding came from government grants, and they lost a lot of that money. And I don't know if any of you remember, if you were paying attention at that time, they were being very aggressive with asking for donations, even more than they normally are. And it was because they had such a deficit going with their income because of the recession. So I know grants are very attractive and they sound great, but if you're relying on those mostly, that can really put your organization in a tight spot if those funds dry up for any reason. And things happen. It doesn't have to just be the economy. It could be something could happen with that organization where it could be something legal. It could be a number of things, but you just don't want to be so reliant on that. I'm not going to get too deep into the other ratio because we're kind of out of time. I'm looking at the clock. We've gone over a couple of minutes. But you will have this for your own records. And again, if you want to have a more in-depth conversation, definitely make an appointment so that we can talk about it.
I guess we should see, are there any questions? I'm not seeing anything in the question section, but we'll give it a minute.
Yeah.
I want to make one comment about grants, because I think a lot of people think, oh, it's free money, I'm going to go for grants. Well, no, it's not free money. It's a contract for service. An organization is going to give you money, and for that money, you're going to do something. You're going to have deliverables. You're going to be required to report quarterly what your progress is. And you know, you don't spend all the money, they're going to want it back. If you don't do what you say you're going to do, they're going to want it back. So grant is a long-term strategy. It takes frequently months to put it together, to submit it, make sure it's on time, and then to hear back. So doesn't look like we have any questions. So you all will be receiving a evaluation after the webinar and with a link to the recording so you can review it again. If you are interested in more in-depth one-to-one consulting, you can sign up as a client with the SBDC. There will be a link in the follow-up email and schedule an appointment to meet with one of our business consultants. If you are interested in doing strategic planning, we can certainly assist with that and help facilitate it. So thank you all for being here. On behalf of Melinda and myself, we hope you got a lot of information, and if you have any questions or need any help, please feel free to give us a call. So thank you again, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Yes, thank you. As Nancy said, here's our information here. Please call the front desk if you are new to the SBDC to inquire about consulting. If that's something you're interested in, you can specifically request us because we talked to you today, but please contact the front desk first. But thank you so much. Have a good day.